This is a series about advanced animation, but we are starting out with the very basics. We already learned that animation is the illusion of movement by changing the position of, for instance, this ball, changing the position every once in a while. We already done that with CSS, but now we've cleared our CSS animation and we want to try it in JavaScript. So let's get going. First, we need to find the ball. So let's create an object called ball. That would be the document query selector hashtag ball. This is our ball. And then we can move it by setting its style transform to translate X, just like we did in CSS, and let's try to translate it 100 pixels. This should move it 100 pixels to the right, and it does. Let's just try 200, and it moves when I reload, and 300, and I also need to reload, and I need to reload again, and 400 should move it to the very end. So this number is the position that must change over time. So let's replace this with a variable, call it position. And let's create it here. Let position be 0. And this positions it here. Then we need some steps where we change this position every time we call the step. So let's create a function called step. And inside that, we modify the position. We simply increment it by 1. And then we set the transform to this position value. So this means every time we call step, we modify the position and we show the ball at the new position. So if we call step here, it moves it just a tiny bit. You can see here it moves ever so slowly every time I press enter and call step function again. We would like to call it self automatically. So let's say we want to wait a tiny bit, say maybe 100 milliseconds. So if we say set timeout and then call step in 100 milliseconds, and then of course we need to start it at some point. So let's start step here. Then we have our animation with JavaScript. Every 100 milliseconds it moves or it changes the position with 1 pixel. If I increase how much it changes, say it adds 2 every time, it moves twice the speed. If I add 3, it moves 3 times, and of course 10 moves 10 times the speed, but still the frame rate is the same. So higher speed with low frame rate, it gets like jittery. But I can increase the frame rate as well. If I say every 10 milliseconds, and then it goes really fast, because as you see, if I increase the frame rate, the speed also increases. And this is where it gets complicated. Because let's say that we wanted a speed of, we wanted to move 400 pixels in 1 second. That would mean that the speed would be 400 pixels per second. And we have a frame rate right now. We have it of not of 10, we have 10 milliseconds between each frame, and that means we have 100 frames per second. And that means that we need to move, or the change should be for each, we want to move it 400 pixels in 1 second. So for each frame, we would need to move it simply 4 pixels, because that would be our speed divided by our frame rate. So if I change this to 4, then we should have an animation going at 1 second. It's probably true. Let's make the animation repeat, by the way. So say if the position is greater than the 400, then the position simply starts at 0. This would make it repeat, 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 repeat. Very good. So let's make these things into variables here. We have the speed, that is 400 pics per second. And we have the frame rate, that is 100. And once again, frames per second. And then here, where we calculate the position, we simply calculate it by saying the speed divided by the frame rate. And down here, we say the frame rate, that's number of frames per second. So that's 1000 milliseconds is 1 second, divided by the frame rate. So this should give us exactly the same animation. Yes. And then if we double the speed, say it should have a speed of 800 per second, then it moves twice as fast, but with the same frame rate. If we lower the frame rate, nothing should happen. There's no difference. If we double the frame rate, there's no difference, because now the speed takes the frame rate into consideration. Usually a frame rate would be, say, 60 frames per second, and it still goes smooth. Try changing the speed, make it slower, and now it's slower, but still incredibly smooth. So that's the basics of JavaScript animation. Now we are ready to make it more advanced.